The Radeon Pro WX 5100 is a pretty interesting little card. Based off of the RX 470D, which was a China-only exclusive, it's a cut-down version of the RX 470 and 570, though in this case has been upgraded back to 8GB of RAM and tuned for a 75-watt TDP. The big brother of the WX 4100, which is built on the same architecture, and as a direct successor to the W5100, it does have a lot of potential, though not necessarily out of the box. At stock settings, you're limited to about 46 watts of power, which ends up being somewhere in the low 600s in terms of clock speed. Not necessarily mind-blowing numbers. And like the WX 4100, you can't overclock it in software, so you need to use a BIOS editor in order to change any of these values. Luckily, since this is really just a 470D, we can actually just enable the higher speeds in the BIOS as well as increasing the TDP back up to 70 watts. This bumps the clock speed up to about 1.1 gigahertz as well as boosts performance by about 50%. And with the latest gaming drivers installed, let's see how it does. Starting out with Overwatch, and it looks like we need to break out the high refresh rate monitor or increase some settings because we are at about 200 FPS on average at 1080p low. That means with this card you can take full advantage of a 144 Hz refresh rate monitor, or you can turn all the settings up and still maintain 60 FPS. As the graphics cards we test keep getting faster, we need to adjust our games in order to make them a little bit more demanding, and so having already removed Sonic Generations, Townscaper, and Super Auto Pets, we have now removed Torchlight and added in PUBG. And at 1080p medium quality settings, we are above 60 FPS. You can go all the way up into the high settings and you'll hover around 60 FPS there too. But if you're looking for a smoother experience, the medium quality settings removes a lot of the dips below 60 FPS. Rolled out is an interesting example here because while we have played at the high settings before, we haven't done so at 1080p. And that's exactly what we're doing here on the WX 5100 with no resolution modifier. There are technically two higher graphics modes available, Epic and Cinematic, and if you wanted to play on those settings you could, but you would have to lower the resolution modifier down a bit. Clear. Lost Ark plays great at 1080p and high quality settings. You could go up to very high, especially if you were okay going a little bit below 60 FPS, but since these types of games are very dynamic and when you have a whole lot of monsters on screen, you are going to dip in performance, I'd recommend leaving it at the high quality setting. TemTem plays great at ultra quality settings at 1080p. You'll still have the occasional dip in performance that is related to loading of assets, and even if you go down to 720p, low quality settings, whatever, it will still be there. So I'd recommend sticking at 1080p Ultra and setting the maximum frame rate to 60, since this helps smooth out the experience. At 1080p low, control plays very well on the WX 5100. Pretty much always north of 60 FPS. This does open up your options in case you wanted to turn on more graphical effects, since you could play it at 720p medium and still maintain 60 FPS, or bump up everything to medium at 1080p and go for a more 30 FPS experience, or 720p high. 1080p high is unfortunately a little bit too much for this card, maintaining about 25 FPS. Though it's really the reflections that are causing this performance dip, so if you wanted to just reduce the reflections down to medium, you would be able to play this at 1080p high settings. I was pretty impressed with the WX 4100 being able to play Dirt 3 maxed out above 60 FPS, and the WX 5100 basically doubles this, bringing it to 120 FPS on average. Pretty impressive for a 75 watt card released back in 2016. Hellblade runs really well on the WX 5100 at 1080p with medium quality settings, but FSR set to balanced. We are north of 60 FPS in most gameplay situations. There are a few dips here and there, especially when there are full screen effects taking place and you are like really close to the character models and things like that. But this doesn't really affect gameplay since you aren't really in control of your character when those things are happening.
Not one of them. I was just hiding. I find I live longer that way.
Timberborn plays at 1080p ultra quality settings, no caveats. Even in troublesome areas like the wheat, 60 FPS at all times. Basically, it's a perfect experience. And that brings us to Halo Infinite, and at 1080p, lowest quality settings, and the frame rate minimum set to 60 and maximum set to 60, you can see we have achieved 60 FPS. This is not technically 1080p anymore since you do have a little bit of a dynamic resolution when you have set the minimum and maximum frame rates, and it's going to be a little bit dependent on the map, but still a very strong showing from a 5-year-old workstation graphics card. And what's crazy to think is that this card still has not yet been replaced by anything in AMD's lineup. Nothing in the RDNA 5000 series has yet broken beneath 130 watts. And for the 6000 series, the only thing that's available is the 6400, which is a little bit more low powered and doesn't include things like GPU encoding. These cards currently sell in the $250 to $300 range, which for a gaming card is not that great. But if you are looking for a single slot card that runs only on PCIe power, this is the fastest option available from AMD.